In an earlier lesson, we learned how to use the exposure and contrast adjustments to quickly fix an image. But sometimes you need to add a little bit more nuance to your corrections, and that's where the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks sliders come into play. Now, to better see exactly what these sliders do and how they can affect an image, I have this nice grayscale image which starts off at 100% white on the left and goes to 100% black, or a zero luminance level, on the right. If we look at our waveform scope, you can see a nice smooth straight line between 100 and 0. So let's take our nice straight line and mess it up a little bit so you can see what these sliders do to a grayscale gradient. The sliders that we've already worked with, exposure, if I move that to the right, you see it brightens the image, but take a look at what happens to that straight line. The line doesn't move up where the 100 goes higher and the 0 goes higher. It creates a curve, it's a logarithmic curve, and it's a more natural way to lighten an image. And if I darken it, the curve goes down from brighter to darker, but again, it's not a straight line. Let's reset that by double-clicking it and take a look at what happens with contrast. When I move contrast to the right, you see this S shape, and an S curve allows you to still keep rich blacks and pure whites, but brings back some detail in your highlights and details in your shadows. If I make it a less contrasty image, again, it's an S curve, but here I'm losing some of that punch. But what I really want to explore is, what do these other 4 sliders do, and what's the difference between whites and highlights and blacks and shadows? Well, the best way to really see how your image is affected is to move the sliders back and forth, and you'll get a good sense of what you're controlling. So I'm going to go to my black slider, and if I move it all the way to the left, you see that the darker areas, the blacks are getting richer, and if you look at the gradient, it kind of moved over a little bit. If I move that all the way to the right, I have less information that is pure black and more information that's gray. So it affects just the dark area of the image, and it's very broad. Now let's reset that back to neutral and see what happens when we move the shadow slider. If I go ahead and lift my shadows by moving it to the right, you'll notice once again the line bends, but not in the very dark areas. It actually is a fine-tuning to those shadowy areas, but not quite black. And the same thing happens when I move it to the left if I want to crush my blacks a little bit. And sometimes I do this if I have noise in an image and I just want to make that a little darker and not affect the whole scene, but hide the noise. Well, highlights and whites work the exact same way. So if I go and I move the whites all the way to the right, I'm brightening the top part of my image, the lighter part of my image, but if I just want to work with a little bit of nuance, I would use the highlight slider. It affects the image in a similar way that the shadows affected the blacks. Now you have a sense of what's happening to the image based on the waveform. Let's take a look at how we would use this knowledge to fix a low contrast, not quite punchy image. So I have this wonderful image of the beach, but if I look at my waveform, you'll notice that not only is it a little bit dark, but its dynamic range is really narrow. So the first thing I might do to fix my luminance is up my exposure a little bit, just so it's kind of in the middle. And then I might try to expand the contrast by, again, moving it over to the right. And if I really wanted to push it, I could go ahead and grab the numerical values and bring it to 150. So right now, the image is much, much better. So if I turn it off, that's my starting image, and that's my ending image. But I want to be able to leverage all of the dynamic range that's available to me. So I want to bring up my lighter areas, and I want to make sure that my blacks are nice and rich. So I'll go down and I'll grab the black slider and I'll move it to the left just until the darkest black hits 0. So now my blacks are nice and rich. I'm going to do the opposite with my whites, and I'm going to click on that and move it to the right to open it up a little bit so it can brighten it up. And this is a sunset, so I may not want it to hit 100. I may just want to bring it up just so they're nice and bright, so I have some really luminous areas. And then I'm going to go back and work with the real nuance, which is my shadows and my highlights. So since I brightened the image, I lost a little bit of detail in my highlights. And that's what's beautiful about this slider is I can move it to the left and fix just that area below the bright whites and bring back some of my detail. Now these sliders are interactive, so as I lower my highlights, I may want to pump up the brighter areas. And the same thing works in the shadows. If I want to see more detail in my shadows, but still keep everything nice and rich in the pure blacks, I could go ahead and move it to the right, and I'm seeing a little more detail. And to keep it from being washed out, I could go ahead and bring the blacks down. All of this is very subjective. You have a waveform monitor to tell you if you're legal and what's happening, but remember, your eyes are looking at an image, and depending on what it is, if it's a night shot or mid-afternoon shot, you're going to want to grade the luminance values to an appropriate level so it looks right to the eye. Now, I like the way the image looks, and once again, I'm going to hit the F key to match frame back to the original, and you see I have a lot more punch in my image, and my blacks are nice and rich. Probably I would add a little more saturation to this image because I did lighten it up, and when you lighten an image, you lose some saturation, but we'll explore that when we start working with basic correction of our hue and saturation in the next lesson.